folks, my name is Rob. Welcome back to another F1 fantasy video. Today we are looking at my race week preview and final thoughts ahead of the Dutch Grand Prix. As always, if you're new around here and enjoying the content, please do like the video and subscribe to the channel. Very much appreciate that. So as far as what this video is going to consist of, we're going to take a look at my thoughts on the race week, the race coming up in Zandvoort, thoughts on chip usage, a few questions I've received on Twitter and YouTube, and then towards the end of the video we'll look at my team and how it's shaping up for the Dutch Grand Prix. So as far as this race is concerned, I don't have any chips on my radar to use. There's been some reports of bad weather coming across the radar heading into the weekend, and obviously that opens the door potentially for the no negative chip, and as well as final fix, we may see some surprises in qualifying as a result of poor weather. So certainly keep those two in the back of your mind. I am not locked in on either of those at the moment. I've already used my final fix in Monaco, so only really no negative comes into play for me here. But as I mentioned, not really sold yet. We'll just have to wait and see, and I'm going to wait as close to the deadline as possible for as much information to decide as to whether that's an appropriate time to use them. Because it's not a sprint race weekend, I don't think there's really a use case for the extra DRS, the limitless, or the autopilot. I think all three of those chips are best used on sprint race weekends. So I'll be no doubt activating the remaining ones I have at those sprint races later in the year. So at this point in time, no chips for me, but I think there's certainly a case, as I said, for the no negative and the final fix if the weather takes a turn for the worse over the weekend. As far as questions I've received on Twitter or X and YouTube from you guys watching the content, I think the one that first comes to mind, the one that's been a standout and the flavour of the month, or the last 2 months given the last month break, has been Lando Norris, Oscar Piastri and the McLaren constructor. We've seen some great performances from them lately in Austria, Silverstone and Hungary. Belgium was obviously not quite up to their standard the last 4 races or so, but I think they're still in the box seat to be featuring in the template, and understandably so. Lando's really looked like the top tier driver we know he's truly capable of, and Oscar's put in some really good performances for a rookie as well. And we've seen a lot of these engaged strategists, managers, whatever you want to call yourself, pile in on these McLaren assets. So I certainly think they're very viable, and I definitely expect them to be featuring quite heavily in the points this coming weekend. I think the dilemma for me right now is obviously whether I go with Lando Norris or Oscar Piastri and the McLaren constructor, or I go 2 drivers and no McLaren. I don't have the funds to go in on all 3 without compromising on Checo, and to be honest, I think Perez is a mainstay in my team. He's got such a consistent performance in terms of fantasy. Obviously his qualifying earlier in the season is another question altogether, but in terms of fantasy output, he is a no-brainer for me, and I don't seem or plan to part ways with him anytime soon. So I think the dilemma comes down to whether or not I want to go double dipping on Lando and his output in the constructor as well, or I go for Oscar, use the McLaren constructor to cover Lando's output, and then use the 5.4 million left over from the difference of Lando and Oscar to redistribute elsewhere in my team. I think obviously we've seen Lando's had 2 driver of the day points in Austria and Silverstone. He had great races there, and certainly bolstered his potential and ownership as a result of those performances. Obviously you don't get driver of the day points through the constructor, but you do get the fastest pit stop points. And even though I plan to go with McLaren regardless of which driver I go for, I think, you know, the McLaren constructor, they've had some excellent pit stop performances of late. They've had 25 fast pit stop points out of a possible 54 prior to Belgium, and 2 of those included the fastest pit stop for that race, so 10 points apiece. So I think they're pretty much a no-brainer for me. But I think where I stand right now in terms of Lando versus Oscar, it does come down a lot to what I can do with that extra 5.4 million, and I certainly think there's a case to be made to get in Fernando Alonso, assuming the Aston Martin upgrades expected for this week go as planned. So I think for me, where I stand is I'll have Oscar, and we'll get to this in a minute. I'll bring in Fernando and then use the remaining funds to pivot to a budget driver, most likely Guan Yu Zhou. So I think the approach here, I really like the case to cover Lando via the McLaren constructor, You get in Oscar Piastri for a piece of that McLaren driver pool, and then, as I mentioned, use the remaining funds to upgrade other areas of your team. Because if you're going Lando and McLaren, I think that really, for most teams, opens the door for only 2 budget drivers or for 2 budget drivers. I'm not particularly high on that at the moment. I think budget drivers do carry some degree of risk. And obviously, we've seen that consistency from Joe throughout the season in his overtakes. But to run 2 of them is probably a little too risky for my taste. And I'd happily be proven wrong if both of them came away. Like, I had Hulkenberg and Albon last race, both within that budget or budget adjacent category in Albon's case. Got very lucky, but I don't think we're going to see 2 budget drivers in your team score double-digit points every single week. So as a result of that, I'm inclined to go Oscar and McLaren unless we see anything else in practice to suggest otherwise. As far as the Aston Martin upgrades are concerned, I think there is some cause for optimism. They have tailed off a little bit in the last few races, and I think that's just because other teams around them, McLaren obviously one of them, have really made their way up the field through successful upgrades. I know I've said Aston Martin have regressed a little bit, and I think that's just partly due to the fact that the upgrades they have rolled out haven't really been quite as effective as what we've seen from the other teams. But I do think Alonso is very tempting if these upgrades do prove to be successful in practice. And I know, as cliche as it is, don't make any decisions until we see practice. But Alonso has been the most consistent of the 3 Aston Martin assets this season. I'm very, very avoidant of the Aston Martin constructor, and part of that has to do with the fact that it covers Lance Stroll's output as well. Don't get me wrong, we've seen some good fantasy performances from Lance this season so far, but to be quite honest, we've also seen some pretty underwhelming ones, and I'm not too high on him as an asset to begin with. To go in on the constructor when I guess you're covering Fernando through that, you can go for Fernando on a standalone basis. You don't have to worry about Lance Stroll at all, and that's kind of the route I'm tempted. Obviously, when Stroll does put in a performance, worthy of attention, then great. He does deliver, those high teen 20 points or so performances. But for me right now, until we see a bit more consistency from that Aston Martin, I'm very reluctant to go for anyone. Obviously, Fernando, because of what we've seen so far, is the most proven commodity and the one I'm most willing to give a chance to in this circumstance. So there is a team build in mind that I've considered that does involve Lance Stroll, but it's not one that is at the forefront of my thinking at the moment. So I think we obviously have to wait until practice, but in the case of Fernando Alonso, I think there's some cause for optimism because of what we've seen so far from him this season. As far as Sergio Perez is concerned, I alluded to this earlier, but I think he is without a doubt one of the must-haves on your fantasy roster. I know there has been a lot of concern around his qualifying performances, but I certainly think he's turned a corner recently. I'm not suggesting he's going to go out and start winning races all of a sudden and knock Max off his perch, but I definitely think he is one that I'm going to find very hard to part ways with. There has been a build I've talked about in my team selection video where you do get rid of Perez in favour of George Russell to triple up on McLaren. I'm not necessarily saying that's a bad build, but for me personally, the strength of the Red Bull, the consistency of what we've seen so far this season makes it very hard for me to go away from any of those 3 right now. We may see some Red Bull regression later in the season when they choose to not move ahead with any future major upgrades. But as it stands, I can't really see Perez leaving my team, and I think there's a reason why he's still owned by 43% of players in the game. You just see that consistency from him when he's on form, and to be honest, he is a driver that when he doesn't have these qualifying issues, he's going to hit 20 or 30 points per race. When he does have qualifying issues, you've got those overtakes and positions gains. So it's really a no-brainer for me at this point in time, and I can't see myself, as I said, trading him out for the foreseeable future. So I do want to quickly take a look at my team this week. I know I've, as I said, alluded to this already in my team selection video, and the build I mentioned before, which involved Oscar Piastri, this also involves a -4 for my team, is sacrificing Alex Albon, which I'm very much on the fence of, and getting rid of Hulkenberg, which I'm very not on the fence of. He had a great weekend, most recently in Spa, but his performances for the most part, have been a dog's breakfast. So I'm not excited about having him in my team for much longer. I know I'm kind of scrolling around here, but Oscar Piastri, as I mentioned, you get a slice of that McLaren driver pool. You get Lando's output in the constructor. That leaves me with 17.6. That would give me room for Fernando Alonso. And if we do see some promising performances in practice, then I think he's a no-brainer for me. And then that just leaves me with enough budget to get the overtake merchant, Joe, into my team, cap out at break even. So I think I'm pretty happy with what this build looks like. But I mentioned just before, it's going to be difficult to part ways with Albon. We saw a great result from him fantasy-wise, most recently in Spa. And then we've got Monza coming up the next race. And I think the Williams is going to thrive on those straight lines. So if you don't want to kind of book in too many transfers in the future, because I do think I will be tempted by Albon, the next race is to go for a build like bring Alex back in, assuming he's in here, and that would give me 9.7. That doesn't really leave us with a lot of options in this price bracket. You've got Gasly, you've got Stroll, you've got Bottas. If the Aston Martin upgrades look promising, then potentially Stroll, but I did say before that inconsistency worries me a little bit. You could go for someone like Pierre Gasly. Obviously a great performance in Belgium. You know, when he is hitting his stride, he is getting those kind of double-digit performances on a regular basis, but he did have that DNF in Hungary. You know, the Alpines have not looked all that reliable lately, so hopefully they've turned a corner and we do see some promising times in practice from Pierre. He's a favourite of mine, but whether or not that's actually going to eventuate, can't really say for sure. So at the moment, my team is most likely going to look like Fernando Alonso and Joe. There are Lando deals out there, and I think he's certainly a viable asset, but for me, I'd much prefer the balance and consistency of what I'm seeing on the screen here. But anyway, that's going to be it for today, guys. I very much appreciate you dropping by. Good luck with your teams this weekend, and I'll see you all very soon.